You're watching Breakthrough News.
You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene per year. Here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Kalik. Rania, great to be back here with you.
Always great to be on with you, Eugene.
Always good. Caught you a little off guard there, huh? The length of the intro.
Yeah, you did. I was like, whoa, what's happening? Not cool, Eugene. Pleasure's all mine.
I control it all.
Out things we say. Yeah.
Wizard of Oz type
Puppet
situation.
master of the show. Yeah.
Well, good to be back with you. Certainly here, after we took a few weeks off, good to be back on our schedule. And shout out to everybody who is watching, tuning in. Very happy to have you with us. And of course, this would be a good time to remind those of you who are watching on YouTube, which I guess is everybody who's watching, to make sure that you hit the subscribe button so that you are able to get hooked into all the things we have from Breakthrough News, and make sure you hit the bell so that you can get the alerts about the things that you have subscribed to receive. So subscribe, hit the bell so you get the alerts. This will also be a great time to, however you want to do so, smoke signal, text message, phone call, alert whoever you know that we are live here on the Freedom Side and that they too can tune in here on YouTube. Got a great show. As always, going to be going around the world and back, a number of important stories here, from the midterm elections in the United States to South Africa's role in many of the cross currents of our multipolar existence, the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia, a really just unbelievable set of stories regarding the death penalty in Oklahoma, as well as a tragic death of a man in South Carolina in the custody of certain jail and prison authorities. So we've got a lot here for you on the show, as we always do, which means that it is, again, a great time to make sure that whoever is following you is following us as we get things started, Rania.
Indeed. And of course, we can't forget to mention that you can support the show and all of our excellent programming here at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And you can also donate below on YouTube, which is always a great option if you just want to throw in a one-time thing. We always appreciate that. But yeah, a lot of stories to get into, Eugene. But before we, I guess, start bringing in guests, we have such an excellent lineup today. We did want to touch on the issue with Haiti right now, which is, I mean, I'll just set this up for you. You've actually been to Haiti. You've reported from Haiti. You're very knowledgeable about Haiti. In fact, you were on Majority Report today, doing an excellent job breaking down the situation there. And I want you to do it here on the Freedom Side as well, because, what we're seeing right now is that the United States, in, I guess, collaboration with Mexico, is attempting to send a force in Haiti, along with the Canadian government, I believe. I mean, can you explain what's going on? It's being portrayed as an invasion. That's not how the U.S. is portraying it, of course, but all in the name of bringing stability to a country that's in chaos and has like a power vacuum. So what's going on?
Yeah, no, well, I appreciate the question. The broad situation is the U.S. and Mexico have authored this resolution that would authorize a multilateral force to go into Haiti under some sort of writ, some sort of mandate. But one thing that's important to note is that even though this is being authorized, or will potentially be passed, authorized, I don't know who they are to be authorizing anything in Haiti, but the UN Security Council is not taking up this resolution with the thought of putting a UN force in there, and it's just not under the Article 7 authority of the United Nations to send in these various United Nations peacekeeping forces. So they're essentially authorizing a multilateral force of, God knows who, to go into Haiti for who knows how long, which I think is extraordinarily dangerous because, beyond just the normal things that we see with a lot of these UN forces that they don't keep the peace, certainly what we've seen in Haiti, where that's been the case with the UN, the United States, and other modalities that have over the years occupied Haiti. But this would be even more lawless than those, and it seems that the UN Security Council would be authorizing a force that would essentially be operating under no real legal mandate or authority of any sort, without any real accountability to some degree. So I think that in and of itself is a notable factor in the nature of the resolution. But the basis of this is the unelected, totally illegitimate so-called Prime Minister of Haiti, Ariel Henry, has called for a quote-unquote special security force I think that's the nomenclature he used, to come into Haiti to help them address allegedly this gas crisis that is going on in the country, and also to assist in terms of, clearing the roads of various blockades by various armed actors. And the whole thing is the only way to address the cholera epidemic, which has infected hundreds of people and killed, I think, close to 24 people so far, is for there to be some sort of foreign international military force to come in and back up Henry. So basically what's happening is you have this guy, Ariel Henry, and he became the prime minister after the last president was assassinated summer of last year. And it's worth noting that this guy Henry got two phone calls from the assassins the night of the assassination, so gives you a sense of his level of involvement. But after that, he was able to assemble a rump of 10 senators who voted that he should be the prime minister, and then the U.S. government called the guy who took over for Jovenel, the assassinated president, his second in command essentially, and they said, you got to hand over power to Ariel Henry. So you've got this totally unelected, unaccountable, completely anti-democratic person ruling without any form of legal authority, where there's no parliament, where the judiciary system is essentially like kind of, depending on the day, either dissolved or barely working. And there's this huge mass protest movement of tens of thousands of people regularly coming out, wanting this government to fall. And so in that context, they are using the pretext of quote-unquote security in order to call for an international forces that will essentially back them up and help them to impose themselves on the Haitian population that does not want this elite cabal that is, masquerading as a government under Dr. Ariel Henry to continue. So, it's a really volatile situation, of course, in Haiti. You've got nearly 5 million people. It's about 42% of the country who are suffering from acute malnutrition and hunger. You've got the cholera outbreak I already mentioned. You've got the skyrocketing cost of living. You've got just the existing poverty. I think it's 68% of Haitians live on less than $2 a day. So you've got, even prior to this crisis, all these other challenges. And because the president before Henry, Jovenel Moise, was also, ruling, he had dissolved the parliament and the judiciary and was ruling by decree. You've had this increasing fragmentation of the state in Haiti, which has led to the rise of these various non-state armed actors, the so-called gangs that are deeply connected to the various elite factions and play an important role in sort of the jockeying for power that's going on in the country right now. So there's a lot on the table here, but I think over and above anything else, we're seeing perhaps another disastrous occupation being foisted on the Haitian people as opposed to them being allowed to have any real sovereignty.
And of course, they don't want it. Like, we've seen protests taking place in Haiti against this sort of intervention. And it's not the first intervention. We'll have to just do an entire episode at some point about Haiti, because I don't even think you could get through to all the interventions in one episode. But the U.S. has been interfering in Haitian politics, controlling. Part of the reason that Haiti has such a weak government in the first place is because of the United States.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think is the actual reason behind this?
It's interesting. I think the real reason that this is happening right now is basically the inability of Henry to have any legitimacy. For several months now, really more than that, about 6 months, the United States, the so-called core group, which is the U.S., the EU, the OAS, sort of the international forces that really control Haiti, they've been trying to promote a condominium government, if you will, between Henry and the forces supporting him, and something called the Montana Accord, which is a group of about 200, civil society and political religious organizations. So, even though it has a lot of its own sort of elite politics to it, it certainly has a much more broad subset of people behind them than Ariel Henry's government. And they have their own roadmap, for how they think the country should get out of the current crisis. And the U.S. has been trying to push the two together, unable to do so because the Montana Accord does not want to have any real truck with Henry and certainly doesn't want him to stay in his current position. They want to push their own roadmap. Obviously, Henry does not want to give up any power at all, so he doesn't want to accept their roadmap. He just wants people to find their own position within his own government. And since that did not succeed, I think what we're seeing is the forces who have been pushing for an invasion of Haiti for some time, which includes the Washington Post editorial board, which has been pushing for this since the end of last year. It includes the president and the political elites of the Dominican Republic, who have their own interests, but have for many, many years been meddling in Haiti exactly in this regard. It includes forces in the OAS and in CARICOM and others. So you've got the individuals who essentially want to get rid of even the fig leaf of democracy and sovereignty in Haiti, and want to establish or really want to maintain the status quo of Haiti being a reserve for hyper low wage labor and the export of things as, from gold to stevia for Coca-Cola from big agriculture and agribusiness plantations. And that's specifically the stevia in your Coke that people say tastes so good and is good for you is coming from land that's being stolen from poor Haitian peasants as we speak. But putting all that aside, without any legitimacy in Henry, there's only really one way you can keep that kind of government going, and that's just with naked brute force that comes from outside the country. And I think those who have wanted to see that for some time are now able to step into the vacuum to some degree that has been caused by the inability to have a change on the ground, because the only way to do that would be to displace Henry, which certainly the core group countries and Henry himself do not want to acquiesce to.
Right. Geez, what a terrible, terrible situation. And it's unfortunate that Mexico is adding legitimacy to it. And so we'll have to keep our eyes on this. We certainly will at Breakthrough News. And also, I imagine you'll be keeping your eye on this at the Punch Out, your daily podcast.
Yes, which will be returning soon, but we'll definitely keep following it, keep looking at it. Tough situation, but a lot to be said rather about it, and a lot more to do. As you said, Rania, for interventions alone, we could have one whole hour-long show. But we want to shift gears here and move to a critically important issue, one that's perhaps underrated here in the Western media, although talked about a little bit, and that is the relationship of African nations, and certainly in this case South Africa, to the broader eddies and currents that have been emanating from the war in Ukraine and the shift towards a more multipolar world. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Kulekana Skosana, who's the chairperson of the African National Congress Youth League International Relations and Solidarity Department, and was actually recently in Russia and observing the referendums that took place there in the Donbass. Kulekana, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And I guess the first question I just want to ask you is, I think many people, when they, certainly here in the United States, as I'm sure you've seen, the referendums that took place for the parts, the elements of the Donbass that have joined Russia were widely panned, widely dismissed as just totally fake, totally false, completely imposed by Russia. And you were there, so I just want to ask you directly, what you were able to observe as it concerns the referendum itself.
Did we lose him?
We might have lost him.
We might have lost him. I thought maybe it was just the camera, but it seems to have been the audio too, because we cannot hear him.
Yeah. I'm waiting.
Maybe he didn't like your question. He's just so angry. I absolutely not. No, thank you. I'm out of here, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, hey, you got to do what you got to do. We're gonna work on getting him back. It's early in the morning there in South Africa, so I understand that technical difficulties can probably.
Is it really early in the morning? What's the time difference?
I think it's like 7 hours. God, I've been to South Africa multiple times and I can't remember. It's late. It's
early, like the
yeah.
middle. No, it's like, okay, it's not. That's like Lebanon. Hang on, it is not the morning there. It is.
It's
like
late
10
at
PM.
night. It's late at night. It's late at night.
It's very early in the morning, 10 p.m. You heard it here on Breakthrough News, guys. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that.
I was thinking,
he's trying. I know he's trying to rejoin
India
right now, so we're working on it.
No, I'm
as we go. But just to say one more thing about Haiti, Rania, while we're waiting, the vote in the United Nations is allegedly supposed to come this week, so there could be a pretty fast moving situation. Although they're saying it could take some more time, some undetermined amount of time to get the multinational force together, because it seems that almost nobody wants to contribute troops, because the obvious reality that I think is clear to most people is that there undoubtedly are people in Haiti who are going to resist. There are some organizations that have already said they will resist with arms. And I think that, at least, again, I don't know if this is true, but from the reporting that I've seen, that both the U.S., Canada, and France have declined to contribute, or at least to lead the force. I don't know if they contribute something. The only two countries that I've seen step up so far are the Bahamas and Guyana. No disrespect to the Bahamas or Guyana, but that does not seem like that's going to get the job done. So that, I think, is the big sticking point of this whole piece is, there's without any real credible partners on the ground. I think that there are a lot of countries who, they look at, say, Somalia in 1993, somewhat similar situation, and they fear the Haitian people potentially inflicting some losses on them. I think we have Kulakana Skosana with the ANC Youth League back with us here on the show. Yes.
Thank you so much for having us. Apologies for that. Someone was disturbing my line. I'm so sorry.
No problem at all. I understand the struggle. And just to ask you the question again, and for those who just joined the show, you were there in the Donbass when the referendums were happening, where the 3 regions assessed themselves, or 4 regions, to become a part of Russia. Now, in the U.S., of course, this has been widely panned as just a totally fake vote and something that was imposed upon these people. So I'm just curious, first and foremost, what your impressions were as someone who was there to observe these elections.
Again, thank you so much for having us, and greetings to your viewers and listeners. We appreciate the time. Look, the right to self-determination is enshrined in the statutes of the United Nations. I think the vote has been declared a very democratic way of resolving decisions that must be taken by a people. We think that the gun is not the correct way to resolve this issue, but the opportunity to vote for us was the greatest way that the people of Donbass could speak for themselves. Too often you have political elites purporting to be representing the views of the people. And we went to the Donbass region to actually hear physically the views of the people and what they want, not what we hear on television, not what we are spoon-fed by media, but what the people themselves want. And what they want is the opportunity to vote and speak, and they did so overwhelmingly. I think also for us to mention is that since the departure of Ukraine from the Soviet Union, you then have Russian minorities in the Donbass region. And these people have been okay with being of Russian descent in Ukraine. However, seemingly the government of Ukraine has not found it acceptable that there are people of Russian descent in Ukraine, and therefore have cancelled the language, continuously persecuted these people and targeted them. And we are actually shunning Western media for its inability to express the genuine views of the people of Donbass. And for us as Africans who are victims of biased media throughout our struggle, we sympathize with any oppressed people in the world. And we think that this was an opportunity for them to express themselves, but also for us to hear from them on the ground, unbiased, no favor, no fear, directly from the people of Donbass. What is it exactly that they want? Not to hear from President Putin, not to hear from Zelensky, but the people themselves. And they've spoken. And I think that must be respected, because our intention and our position as a country and as a people is that of peace, and it's that of conversation, and it is that of self-determination. And I think if the United Nations truly wants to represent what is written in its documents, they are supposed to allow the people to express themselves.
It's really incredible how the parameters of thought on this issue in much of the global South is so different than what's being discussed in places across Europe and in the United States, or North America, I should say, where it's a very one-sided, it's not even a debate, it's just one side. It's pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia, pro-NATO, nothing else. And it's actually really important that we hear from voices from across Africa and other parts of the global South, because even in countries that are allied with the United States, people have even some, in cases, pro-Russian sentiments that in many ways date back to historical ties with the Soviet Union, and especially with what you're talking about, where the Western media and where the West stood on the issue of apartheid, for example. But I'm curious if you've seen any kind of pushback from the Americans. We see that, you're probably familiar with Victoria Nuland. She's quite famous when it comes to the issue of Ukraine and what happened in 2014. And now she's sort of been dispatched by the United States to try to get many African countries, particularly in Northern Africa, to back the American position and take an anti-Russian stance. And I'm curious if you see anything like that being successful across the African continent, or, even in South Africa, have there been attempts by the U.S. to try to pull South Africa in the direction of being on the American pro-NATO side? And what has been the response to that?
I don't think anyone should be pro any superpower. If we are to be pro anything as a people who believe in democracy, democracy, by the way, is Greek, and it stands for by the people, for the people. And if anyone should speak, it's the people themselves. And how people speak anywhere in the world in a democratic process is through a vote, not through a gun. And we think that, I don't know this Victoria you speak of, but in Africa, as victims of oppression, we are on the side of all the oppressed people of the world. And what we are saying is that just because you are going to bombard us with your views on CNN and all these platforms, it doesn't mean that we are going to swallow them, especially after 400 years of oppression. European countries have not apologized for what they've done in Africa. They continue to attempt to undermine the sovereignty of African people. And that is why we subscribe to democracy, we subscribe to peace, and we subscribe to friendship. And we think that if anyone has the interest of the people of Donbass at heart, they should not sabotage the attempts of the people to speak for themselves. The people of Donbass don't get an opportunity to be on Western media. They don't get an opportunity to be on platforms such as this ones. And as beneficiaries of international solidarity ourselves, we would not be anywhere if people of the world did not speak on our behalf on what South Africa has been doing to our people, the former apartheid government. And we don't think that anyone should depend on television alone in terms of how they formulate their view. And there's a very famous song in America that says, the revolution will not be televised. And that's what exactly we found. You go to Donbass, you discover that Kyiv and the Ukrainian government are not innocent at all. They've been continuously attacking those people. I mean, you cannot say that you allow people to have their own view and self-determination, yet you kill their language. It's a fact that the Ukrainian government cancelled the Russian language in their curriculum and in their schools, and they continue to target and persecute. We know about the coup that took place in 2014, and nobody has been speaking about the attacks that the people of Donbass have been receiving from the Ukrainian regime, as much as it took a lot of time for the international community to understand our struggles as a people in Africa. Now, it is important for us as victims of oppression, of 400 years of oppression. I mean, we were put in slavery, we defeated slavery. We had colonialism, we defeated it. Now we know that there is hope against oppression. And anywhere we smell or sniff oppression, we will go there and we will be on the side of the people. We are not on the side of the West or the East, Russia or America. We're on the side of the people. We think that is very important. And that is what we went there to engage the people on. And honestly, what we found is refugee camps that have been bombarded by the Ukrainian regime. If you have a quarrel with Russia as a federation, then you should be targeting military installations. There's no justification by the Ukrainian government to attack ordinary citizens purely because they are of Russian descent. And this is what we have found, that there is ethnic targeting of Russian minorities. And as someone who is a victim of ethnic target, because I'm black, I've been at the receiving end of oppression. I understand what it is to be a victim and to have nobody to speak for you. That is why at the beat of the drum, I went to Donbass without care and fear whether I'll be sanctioned or declared undesirable, because even the Nelson Mandela that is celebrated in America today was once called a terrorist. So we are not going to be spoon-fed by Western media on what we should decipher. Just because they used to give instructions to our forebearers and dictate in our continent, they should not think that in 2022 they can dictate. And we are saying that we are on the side of peace and we are on the side of human preservation.
Oh no. We may have lost him again.
Yeah, I think someone was calling him. And
Oh, maybe he's on his phone.
might have cut him out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but very good. I mean, points that are very well taken. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I think it's, one of the most notable factors, I think, about what we've seen, through this whole conflict is that, there are many countries around the world that, for obvious reasons, don't want to be forced to pick a side in a conflict that's not really about them. But, they are, of course, so demonized. And we saw and have seen Anthony Blinken say, well, we're not going to make Africans choose. We don't want Africans to have to do what they want to do. But, one quick thing, we do have Kolakana back, and I want to ask him one quick thing before we let him go and go to our next guest here and move on to the U.S. midterms. And Kolakana, thank you so much for coming back with us. And before we let you go, I did want to ask you one more question, because I think after your last answer, a really important sort of piece here and something that underpins this entire thing is this whole idea of a unipolar hegemony, that one country should just tell everyone else what to do. And I know that next year, 2023, South Africa is assuming the BRICS presidency. And, I'm curious your thoughts about the importance of multipolarity, of a multipolar world, and what some of your hopes might be for the vision South Africa can bring to that table in a very prominent position, which is the BRICS presidency.
Just before I answer that question, this is exactly what we're talking about. I keep getting cut from the line because people know that I'm doing this interview and they are not happy about that. So they keep calling me. My sincere apologies. Our position as a country is that we want a multipolar world purely because America and Europe have chosen to use sanctions as weapons of war. And what we need to tell the people is that sanctions at the very end of it, they affect the people directly. If you've got a quarrel, I maintain, if you've got a quarrel with Russia, you then target military installations. But when you target civilians, your own civilians, it tells us that what they have been telling us, that you've been attacking them since 2014, is very true. And in terms of BRICS, we think that there must be a balance in the world, and nobody should have the right to punish people on the basis of their convictions and impartiality thereof. The US Congress has decided to vote on punishing African countries that have abstained, by the way, in the vote for the United Nations. Our country has continuously invited Ukraine on a proposal towards peace, but they've not want that. We've never seen this unprecedented amount of weapons that have been sent to Ukraine. Instead, in 2021 in Africa alone, you had more than 5 coups. And what do we receive? We receive water, and people come here to take Instagram pictures and to pretend as if they're in solidarity with the oppressed people of Africa. The grain that was in Ukraine and the grain that was in Russia has not arrived in Africa. They said that they want the grain to leave Odessa so that it can arrive in Africa, but not a single a truckload of grain has arrived in sub-Saharan Africa, which is most affected by this conflict. So we are not going to allow in 2022 the reversal of dictatorship and the continued plowing of our resources. People want Africa as a basket. If anyone is a donor in the world, it is Africa, because we feed all these countries, but we are being purported and viewed as desperate and hungry people. We are not. If we were hungry and poor, the West and Europe would not be coming here begging for our resources. And we want to say that we are part of BRICS, we support BRICS, and we want a multipolar world where no country can dictate to everyone else where they should go. And they can bring all the duress and all the pressure, but we are steadfast and we are determined that we will speak for ourselves, just like Nelson Mandela, who I maintain was once called a terrorist and today is celebrated. So we are not worried about what is referred to as Russia. We know that Russia is in the interest of the people. If Russia is willing to endure economic sanctions at the behest of defending the defenseless, then we will stand with the oppressed people of the world, and not limited to Palestine, Cuba, and Western Sahara. President Biden went to Tel Aviv, and he met with the president of Palestine. Before he landed back in Washington, Gaza was being bombed. We did not see any sanctions being imposed on Israel. Israel has continued to disrespect United Nations resolutions. So we've got a problem with the West and Europe that is selective and biased on which United Nations resolutions must be implemented. And I maintain we have seen an unprecedented amount of weapons going into Ukraine, but we continue to receive water bottles and rice here, and it's called solidarity. So if you are an American and you are on the side of peace, you'll take the initiative of hearing from the people of Donbass themselves what they want. You don't have to listen to Russia. You don't have to listen to America. Listen to the people. And that's why we went to the Donbass area. And we are looking forward to hosting BRICS in 2023. And part of the discussions we will have there is how we include young people in decision making, and how we, as the third world, can participate in the discourse of the world. And we think that no more and no longer should Africa be seen as a charity case. We don't want your charity. We don't want your humanitarian aid. We want you to respect our land and to respect our sovereignty and to stop plowing our mineral resources. And we want to say to the American people and progressive people of the world that if you stand with democracy, then you will stand with the people of Donbass who want self-determination. And that's our position as an organization.
Mm-hmm. Kulakanas Kosana, the chairperson of International Relations and Solidarity for the African National Congress Youth League, ANC Youth League. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side. Well, Rania, we're going to keep pushing forward here on the show. I think, interesting and important perspective there. For those who don't know, the African National Congress is the ruling party of South Africa. So very important organization, very important country in the context of the world. But we're going to switch back to this side of the world, to the United States here, Western Hemisphere, and we want to talk a little bit about the midterm elections, midterm madness, if you will, coming up in a couple weeks here in the U.S., and we are honored, quite frankly, to be joined here by David Sirota, who's the founder and editor of The Lever, and also the co-author of the Oscar-nominated film Don't Look Up, also a former speechwriter for Bernie Sanders. David, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'll tell you, the pleasure is all ours. We're a couple weeks away here now from the midterm elections in the U.S., a lot on the line. The elections are seemingly very tight in the House and the Senate. I think, let me just not editorialize too much. I mean, I'm curious what you think about why these elections are so close. I mean, obviously, usually the president's party loses in the midterms and this, that, and the third. But what do you think is behind the sort of neck and neck race for where we are right now?
Well, I think you're right to point out that midterms in a president's term, when a party controls Congress and the White House, usually has been tough for the party in control. So in one way, it's kind of amazing that at least the polls suggest that it's a very close election. So that's kind of an amazing thing. I think what it says is that the Republican Party has not completely capitalized on the inherent opportunity of a midterm election, because I think a lot of the public still perceives the Republican Party, rightly so in my view, to be a completely extremist party that is wildly out of step with the public on a lot of major issues. Now, I do think that the Democrats have basically decided to not campaign on any economic issues at all. We at The Lever did a report looking at the aggregate ad spending, and the party has allowed itself to get outspent dramatically on economic issues in an election where the public is saying, according to many, many polls, that inflation and the economy are the number one issue, far and away more important in voters' mind than issues like voting rights, than issues like democracy, issues like abortion rights. And to be clear, I'm not making a value judgment on that. I'm telling you what the polls say voters say is important here. So the Democrats have a substantial gap in these polls on economic issues because they've just not been campaigning on them at all. They've not even been trying to offer up a message. And Republicans have been hammering the Democrats on inflation. Now, the Republicans haven't, to my mind, been offering up any solutions to the economic crises that the country is facing. But the Democrats haven't really gone out there and pitched why reelecting them will solve economic problems. And I think the reason for that, there's two real reasons for that. One, I think the abortion issue has become even more salient than normal because of the Supreme Court's Dobbs ruling, and so I think the Democrats see an opportunity there to really press their advantage on that issue as the pro-choice party. But I also think that the Democrats don't want to offend their corporate donors, and campaigning in a populist way on economic issues, specifically making the argument that that inflation is really being driven by corporate profiteering. That's not a message that the Democratic Party's corporate sponsors really want the party to air. It's not a message that corporate media really wants to hear. So I think ultimately that has created the dynamics whereby Democratic leaders have said, well, listen, abortion is a very salient issue this year. We don't really want to offend our corporate, our big money donors. So let's just campaign almost exclusively on abortion. It's a big gamble because I'm coming to you from Colorado. Colorado in 2014 was the home state of the cautionary tale of a guy named Mark Udall, an incumbent Democratic senator campaigning in the wreckage of the financial crisis, another economic emergency. And he campaigned almost exclusively on abortion, and he lost a very winnable Senate seat. So what it kind of feels like, at least right now, unless there's a turnaround in the message for Democrats to focus on economic issues, is that the 2014 cautionary tale of Colorado has become a preview of their 2022 strategy.
It's just so crazy. They're like, it's just Democrats completely blowing it when they actually have arguments on their side. And who was it? Was it Steve Bannon who recently said that, please, I hope the Democrats keep talking culture war issues. It's great for us. They don't touch the economy. But in that sense, I mean, you start to wonder, do Democrats like to lose? Because it's like you even have Joe Biden coming out. You know, the White House came out and they finally rolled out their application process for people to be able to apply to get student debt relief. And there's a lot of issues with the student debt relief program. Like, I still have student debt and I'm so confused about certain aspects of it. I'm not sure which ones qualify and don't. But that said, I don't even see them bragging about that. Like, that's something that they could actually brag that they did. And they're not even touching it or saying it. So it makes you wonder, does this party like to lose because that's how they raise money? Like, is it really just that they don't want to upset their corporate donors? Because, you know, Republicans have corporate donors, even more corporate donors probably than Democrats have. And they're happy to run around talking about the elites are after us. The elites are after us. So, like, what's the deal with Democrats? They can't even brag about the few things they do that are actually helpful.
It's a great question. I mean, there are things that Democrats could be talking about that they have done or are put in place that will be happening. For instance, there was a bill. It was substantially watered down, of course, but the bill to allow some limited Medicare negotiation on prescription drugs to start reducing the price of some medications. They could be out bragging about that in a much more vociferous way. Polls show that the public barely knows that happened. The Democrats, to my mind, the one that's mind-boggling is the Democrats really don't get a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry anymore. And the Republican Party gets a ton of fossil fuel money. I mean, just a huge amount. I mean, it's been an incredible shift. The oil and gas industry has just gone full in on the Republican Party. And the Democrats' most straightforward argument could be there was a vote in the House on anti-price gouging legislation. The Democrats could be going to the public saying, listen, we've been trying to take on the oil companies who are fueling the inflation crisis by jacking up energy prices and reaping record profits. We've been trying to solve that problem. But the Republican Party has been defending its donors. Elect more of us, and we will challenge and take on and defeat the oil companies that are literally fueling the inflation crisis. They have not made that argument at all. The question of why they haven't made that argument, I mean, that is the big question. Is it stupidity? Is it they're out of touch? Is it they have a different calculation that they think that abortion, voting rights, talking a lot about the January 6th riot will be a better for them in the polls, just a strategic difference? It's hard to say what it is. But I go back to the shocking thing. This is the party that the mantra of "it's the economy, stupid" was the Clinton campaign's Democratic mantra. Like that came from the Democratic Party. It is a rule of thumb, really a kind of an axiom of political campaigning. And somehow they are heading into an election where voters are saying overwhelmingly that inflation and the economy are the top issues, and the party does not have a message. And ultimately, the problem with that is that even if the Republicans are not putting forward a coherent economic program, that if one party is at least speaking to the public on economic issues, positioning itself, portraying itself as caring about those issues, and the other party that happens to be in power looks like it doesn't even care about the economy, history suggests that the party that's at least talking about it will win power. In my view, that's especially at a time when Republicans are threatening to essentially end or at least limit elections and democracy in the future. That would be a huge disaster, not just for the current election cycle, but potentially structurally for whatever is left in America of democracy.
Mm. No, I think those points are very well taken. And with things like, Moore v. Harper on the table in the Supreme Court, obviously, the dangers are very, very high here. And it just feels like, maybe to extend your point a little bit here too, because it's very well taken, that there's almost this negative feedback loop that to the extent that it feels like people feel, oh, well, Republicans are talking about the issues that, are sort of the life and death issues for me, my pocketbook issues, that it also helps drive the feeling that, well, maybe they're right about some of these other issues. And the very fact that they're able to say, well, they don't care about you, whether you'd have enough to eat or not, they just care about whatever, immigration. I mean, it's all demagoguery, but it seems like it has like a negative feedback loop that helps drive some of those sort of worst impulses in our society around race, around, gender, around immigration, around all these different pieces, because it seems that Republicans have this monopoly on, seeming to care about people's economic issues. And it just has this, I don't know, I'm going to keep saying the same thing over and over again, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Absolutely. Look, we know that when politics becomes purely a culture war and not about economics, bad things tend to happen. I mean, that is the basic truth. And I think that Republicans know that. That's probably why Steve Bannon apparently said that they know that if there is a conversation about culture, it means that their party the Republican Party doesn't have to answer for its fealty to the oligarch class. But of course, the Democrats have their own fealty to that class, and they are missing a huge opportunity. Now, look, I'm sure there are voices in the Democratic Party saying, "Look, the presidency is controlled by the Democrats. Congress is controlled by the Democrats. There's nothing we can go out and say on the economy because the economic problems, we effectively own them." I just think that's nonsense. It's just nonsense. I mean, there is a cogent argument to make. And I have been a critic of the Democratic Party not going far enough, not pushing enough on economic issues, economic legislation. But there is certainly a cogent argument to make that even the kind of watered down Democratic economic agenda, parts of it have been blocked by the Republican filibuster, by Republican obstructionism. Parts of the social safety net, the social contract have been shredded, the economic social contract by the Supreme Court. The Democrats could be going out and making that argument, even though they are in power. My guess is that they're a little bit afraid to try to make that argument because they're afraid that the public, to make the election about the economy would be to become a referendum on the Democrats in power. But here's the fact. The fact is, whether they want to make the election about the economy or not, the election is largely about the economy and specifically about the inflation crisis. Running away from it, not having anything to say about it, is just an enormously huge and unnecessarily risky gamble.
Do you think part of this is also the consequence of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party consolidating its control over the party after 2020? I mean, after Bernie Sanders lost the primary, you really don't see the media paying attention to anything someone like Bernie Sanders or the so-called squad are saying. Actually, I'm not sure what anyone in the squad is saying about inflation, but I know Bernie Sanders has said things about it, but he's just not given the same platforms. After Joe Biden won, it was kind of like, okay, this is twice now. We're like the consultants who lost in 2016 felt vindicated in 2020. They're all back in charge and their ideas suck. And, is that part of it here? The fact that like the progressive, segment of the Democratic Party has just been like suffocated almost like into silence?
Well, I think that's part of it. And I also think that when you have a party that's led by a relatively weak president who does not really effectively use the bully pulpit, it's hard to know where Joe Biden really is on economic issues. There's sort of a vacuum. So there's everyone's looking to the White House, to the leader of the party, and the leader of the party just hasn't aggressively put forward on a day-to-day basis a clear economic argument. I mean, to be clear, I think some of the things that the Biden administration have done has been pretty good and frankly better than the Obama administration, the last Democratic administration. I think the first social safety net spending bill right when Biden got in was a hell of a lot better than the meager stimulus plan and bank bailout that Obama did when he first got in. So I think there's good things to say about some of the things that the Biden administration have done. But I think that the presidency has not, the bully pulpit of it, has not been used effectively on economic issues. So there's kind of a vacuum. Nobody knows where to look for who the actual voice, the economic voice of the Democratic Party really is, especially, by the way, after that long drawn-out process over the so-called Build Back Better bill, which was then whittled down into the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think that there's no one speaking. The party is not speaking in a unified, clear fashion on what it would even do on the economy. And I go back to, again, the missed opportunity here of there is a very powerful argument to make about corporate profiteering that I think the public is inclined to believe. You have record inflation, but also record corporate profits. You've got plenty of stats out there showing us, telling us, making the argument that inflation is being driven not by some extra spending. 2 years ago, people got a $1,400 one-time $1,400 survival check. There's plenty of data to show us that what's really driving this are just corporations have become oligopolistic, large, with huge market power, and they can just use inflation or the excuse of inflation to jack up prices. I mean, I go back to a story that we reported at The Lever recently. Health insurance. Health insurance is a business that does not rely on supply chains. It is a business of paperwork. Mm-hmm. Health insurance in this country, the prices went up 24% in 1 year. And health insurance is a highly consolidated industry. Most people, in my view, will believe an argument that part of what's driving inflation in their day-to-day lives, higher healthcare bills, higher healthcare premiums, as an overall part of inflation, cost of living crisis that they're facing, that is simply a bunch of 6 or 7 healthcare companies got together and decided, hey, we're just going to jack up prices. The Democrats could be making an argument about that. They're not making an argument. And is it a coincidence that the party gets a lot of money from the health insurance companies, or is that actually salient? Is that actually driving their strategic decisions not to really talk about this? I think it's a little bit of both.
I'm really glad you brought up your recent report from The Lever, because it does remind me of another element of this too, which is, the role of the media and how they sort of set the stage on these. I mean, one of the more interesting things I remember I heard, I think it was from Faiz Shaker after the 2020 Bernie campaign, was that one of the challenges is that the media never really tells working class stories. And that, all you hear is sort of, all the things that we hear in the mainstream media. But that really, it's difficult for people to even parse a lot of the issues that are in front of them because they're not given the correct information. And I was wondering your thoughts just about the role of the corporate media and kind of putting its thumb on the scale in a lot of these debates.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, look at the discussion about inflation. The discussion about inflation, you hear a lot about quote unquote wage inflation. I mean, you hear that. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, you've got a Fed chairman who literally said that his goal is to quote get wages down. The kind of corporate elite media discussion about inflation is almost exclusively the diagnosis is the government spent too much money momentarily helping people, and prices are crushing people. That's the centerpiece of the discourse, the corporate media discourse about inflation. What's not mentioned very much is companies are making record profits. Companies that have market power, aka they can raise prices without fear of competition. That is not part of the discourse. It's just barely part of the conversation. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Corporate media outlets are corporate. They don't want to ask difficult questions about the corporate sponsors that are driving the problem. Now, we at The Lever, we report on this every single day. We are a follow the money investigative journalism outlet that covers the money, covers what's really going on. And we're only able to do it because we're reader supported. But here's the problem. The problem is that independent media, it is growing, but corporate media is still the dominant force in the discourse. So you've got a situation where the Democrats as a party are not making an argument about corporate tiering in an election that's going to be predicated where voters are saying inflation is the biggest issue. And you've got a corporate media environment which doesn't want to talk about corporate profiteering either. So you're left with I've said this before, I'll say it again. Part of the democracy crisis, if you really want to get serious about what the democracy crisis is you've got an economy that is in crisis, the crisis being fueled a lot by corporate power, and the election discourse, the discourse in how we decide a democratic election, barely is talking about this at all. That ultimately, that kind of corporate media influence, dominance of the democratic, small d democratic discourse is a huge part of the democracy crisis in America.
Mm-hmm. Well, David Sirota, founder and editor of The Lever, that's levernews.com, levernews.com. Hope everyone checks it out and supports it. And we thank you so much, David, for being with us and giving us some of your precious time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks to both of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I go ahead. No, you.
I was just gonna say that maybe if the Democrats started actually talking about the economy, people would be like, well, why don't you just put price controls in place to control inflation? And then they'd be like, whoa, you've gone too far. Whoa. They start talking about if they start saying, oh, it's corporate profits. Well, okay, cap the prices. Wait, hold on. And then you get into a real conversation about capitalism, don't you?
No, and I think that is the real question. I mean, I think the Democrats have this existential sort of challenge that they have is that Republicans are just 100% pro-capitalism. Everything about capitalism that's bad, they say is good. You know what I mean? So from their perspective, they really lose nothing by going to the right because it sort of just goes further in the direction of
Further
their core beliefs,
reinforces,
right? So
yeah.
in a way, it seems more truthful. But Democrats claim to not be that way. They claim to care about people for healthcare, for climate change, for workers' rights, for unions. And so they have a challenge, though, is that the further left you go, the further you go to what people who are Democrats want to see, the more the people who are keeping the lights on at the DNC are like, whoa, wait a second. We're not paying you to actually help people. We're paying you to be like a slightly different alternative to the Republicans, which is good because we want people to think it's a democracy so they don't revolt. But like ultimately at the end of the day, you can't go too far. So the Democrats get stuck in this weird middle ground to where they want to be constantly saying, yes, we love you, masses of people, struggling people trying to make it, and we're out here for
we
you.
can't do anything about it.
And but at the end of the day, they can't actually deal with this contradiction. It's a fundamental contradiction. They either have to ditch the donors, and that's what Bernie Sanders was saying, right? He was saying, ditch the donors. Let's go with regular people. He raised $400 million in 2 elections in 2 years from just average everyday people. But then you saw what happened. They took him out. They sabotaged it. I mean, I don't even want to say that they beat him. I mean, they sabotaged his ability to succeed, both years. And, year one, it was maybe more blatant, but I think year two, it was also there. I guess the second time he ran, it was also more blatant. So again, it's a contradiction that not only can't be resolved, but for whom the establishment figures. And I think sometimes the thing we forget is how much money is really being made on this. I'll never forget that I was reading an article. Oh Lord, where was this? It might have been in the Washington Post, but it was about two relatively young individuals. They were in, I think, their late 20s, and they had been Democratic consultants that had worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign that lost in 2016. Lost, so didn't win, lost. But that they had both bought brand new homes in the U Street area of Washington, D.C. And for those who don't know Washington, D.C., that means they bought multi-million-dollar homes. So even though they lost, they did so well in terms of the payment, they were doing better than 99% of the people living in Washington, D.C., buying these million-dollar homes, where, of course, people have been displaced for years, poor and working-class black people, to make room for this. And, you look at the staffer to lobbyists to media buyer, sort of consultant industrial complex. And this sort of, unaccountable, hard to pin down kind of network of people. And if anyone who's lived in DC and works in politics, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You jump from this place to this place to this place. You leverage your public sector career or your campaign career to become a consultant, to become a lobbyist. Then you lobby it to start your own company. I mean, these people have a lot riding on the Bernie Sanders of the world failing, on the people who are out in the streets protesting for Black Lives Matter not being able to gain any political power, for trade unions not to be able to have card check and sign people up easily to join unions. They don't want any of that because that's what's going to stop the gravy train they're getting from these big corporate donations. And it really is it's why, to me, the Democrats are going to continue to fail to succeed, because you can't really straddle the fence between people who feel it's okay to have an economy that destroys people's lives on the regular and people who feel like, no, the economy and the government should be working to help people.
And no, it's such an important point. That contradiction is huge. And then there's like what you're talking about is essentially also like a company, and a company, by the way, that profits when it loses and is in the opposition. Mm-hmm. But let's not forget how much the Democrats brought in, like record amounts of money when they lost to Donald Trump.
Consultants never lose.
Huge money maker. Yeah, consultants, you could, and the fact, like what you're saying, like imagine putting on your CV that you worked for the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. You would think that would be something that you might want to pretend never happened. But instead, it's actually a huge career booster.
I remember that guy, incredible. Robbie Mook, who was her campaign director. I saw him like get some other political job shortly thereafter. And I was like, well, didn't he just prove that he's not actually good at his job?
I mean, you would think.
Especially because we had the emails, where they were saying how we don't need to go to Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, like states that anyone who ever follows politics know are critical, because we had a computer simulation.
It's like they were
And I talked
trying
to someone in that
lose.
2016 campaign who was working in Pennsylvania, and they told me that they had stacks and stacks and stacks of voter contact sheets from door-to-door campaigning that was showing that they were losing to Trump in Pennsylvania. And they were like calling the headquarters, and they were like, where do we send these files so that you can see that things are really getting bad here? And they were like, oh, no, you don't need to send them. It's fine. Like, it's all
From
going to
their
work out.
offices in New York. From their offices in New York. They were like,
Yeah.
no, it's cool. Our computer simulation has this.
Someone
No
told me
worries.
that it had something to do with Xbox. I don't really know anything about that, but I remember something having to do with Xbox also being involved in those simulations. But either way, it just shows that consultants on both sides never lose. It's partially, it's partially why whenever there's an economic downturn, DC never has it as bad as the rest of the country, because there's always money coming in from lobbying and consulting. Like, that never ends. The lobbyists trying to get whatever cash they can get, or companies lobbying to get whatever cash they can get, countries lobbying to get whatever handouts they can get, and consultants who are then selling it all to the world. That gravy train never ends, and it basically props up the economy.
It's a huge scam. It's such
Certainly
a huge
the restaurant
scam.
industry. Shout out to Anonymous for the
Oh.
20 Canadian dollars you just threw in there. $5 to
How's
Anonymous
the-
for American dollars. We're somewhat international here, crossing borders, Canadian and American dollars so far. Maybe some euros we can get in here.
Do we want euros? I mean, they do. How much are they worth these days? We want.
Well,
euros.
the
I'm
euro I think
joking.
is not
I'm
doing that
joking.
well.
Give us your euros.
The
No, it's
the
not.
rupee
It's not.
in India is rising. So if anyone want to throw in some rupees, good for us, bad for
Can
the
India
export industry of
donate?
India.
There's like a list, by the way, an interesting fact, little known fact. There's like a list of countries that can donate in both Super Chat and on the donation button on YouTube. And it's like really random. Some of them just aren't there. Like a lot of really big countries. I don't think Brazil, people in Brazil can't donate to the show.
Well, I'm sorry to hear.
I don't know who determines that.
Here. Shout out to the people of Brazil. Well, it's an issue we're going to come back to
Yeah.
next week. Big elections coming up there. Well, we are going to switch topics here to another huge topic, and that is the ongoing conflict in the northern area of Ethiopia. And we are very happy to be joined again by friend of the show, an Ethiopian-American journalist, Hermela Aregawi. Hermela, thank you so much for being back with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me again. Good to see you guys.
No, well, great to see you, and it's our pleasure, of course, to have you. I mean, we're in sort of an interesting moment, it seems, here as it concerns the conflict. I've never actually determined what we should call this conflict. Northern Ethiopia, in Tigray, in the Horn of Africa, touches on so many different things. But whatever you call it, it does appear that there's something of an end game in play here. Tough to know 100%, but there is been quite a bit of fighting going on. Certainly, there's been talks going on about sort of the possibility of peace negotiations starting in 4 days in South Africa. I mean, maybe just back of the envelope here, Hermela, despite the fact that I know there's a fog of war element. I mean, does it feel like this, multi-year conflict is coming to a close soon, or is perhaps everyone talking about how it could be over a bit of a false dawn?
That's a big question. So I think the first question is, what does it look like for the war to be over? And so I think the first step would be for the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian National Defense Forces to go into the capital of the Tigray region, Mekelle. They have not gone in there yet, but they have controlled several key cities around the capital. So when that happened, to what happened 3 weeks into the war in 2020, when they essentially just parachuted into Mekelle overnight, after, of course, a lot of efforts to get to there, they controlled the capital of that region, and that was a sense that the Ethiopian government had the leg up on the war. So I think that is the first step in so many ways. I think the difference now as to 2 years ago is the Ethiopian government has learned a lot. First of all, they've been able to recruit a lot more soldiers in the last 2 years, because as you guys know, but maybe some of the audience doesn't know, the previous government, the now TPLF rebels, minority government that's in the Tigray region, occupying that region, they had the majority of the country's armament, the majority of the soldiers. They placed their people all over Ethiopia. Really, the fact that Ethiopia is even as far as it's gotten in terms of being able to ward off the TPLF rebels from coming into the capital and essentially taking over the country is a little like a miracle, to be honest. But since then, although there's a lot of effort that were being done before then in terms of strengthening the Air Force, that we learned that the Prime Minister was doing kind of undercover. But since then, there's been an active trying to recruit soldiers. And so they're a lot more equipped to do this than they were 2 years ago. But still, we haven't seen any TPLF leadership captured. 2 years ago, the way that some of the top leaders like CU Mesfin, Abbas Ahai, Asmalash, three top executive leaders, the way they were captured is they were essentially killed because they wouldn't surrender, is at least one version of the while they were hiding in the mountains. And so I don't personally want to see this TPLF leadership dead. I want them to be captured and actually go through the system and tell everybody what the hell happened, whose idea was this, did anybody decide that maybe this wasn't a good idea. So I think having some of the leadership captured will take some of the air out of the activists here in the diaspora that are just warmongering, that really don't want to see Tigray see peace if it means it's peace under the Ethiopian government. So that's the first step. And then I think even after that, though, there's going to be a lot of disruptions in different part of the region where maybe the rebels are hiding. There might be efforts to try to cause disruptions in other parts of Ethiopia. This is an ideological war to some degree. And so first you take out the political leadership, and then you've got to work on the ideology. And I think part of that is the Ethiopian government, like they did recently and did again 2 years ago, they drop in leaflets into Tigray that said, we are your government, you are our people, we are responsible for you, we want you to get your basic needs met. It is not what you have been hearing, because mind you, they're basically in this really bubble where they're only hearing their media that tells them the Ethiopian government, the Ethiopian people, Eritrea are out to come exterminate them. So there's a lot of undoing that needs to happen, and I think that will be the next war. But first, we got to take this leadership out, because that I think will relieve some people and then maybe deflate some people's efforts here in the diaspora.
You know, it was so interesting to me over the weekend, I think it was. I woke up and I opened Twitter, and on my For You page, the top story was that all these American officials are calling for a ceasefire in Ethiopia. And I mean, this was actually really surprising. The African Union essentially released a statement calling for a ceasefire that was almost like plagiarized from the Americans. But this has been an ongoing issue with this war, is we don't hear anything from the Americans when the TPLF is on the offensive, right? When they're going into other regions, attacking, taking over towns, committing atrocities. But as soon as the TPLF is in a weak position or perhaps about to be beaten, then suddenly we need a ceasefire immediately. And suddenly you'll see statements from TPLF leaders demanding a ceasefire. We're ready for negotiations. We're suddenly ready for a ceasefire. I'm curious if actually maybe both of you can speak to that. Hermela, can you speak to that pattern? And then Eugene, I know this is an issue you follow very closely. Can you speak to the significance of the African Union releasing a statement demanding a ceasefire as well, in much of the same language the U.S. uses?
Yeah, we are sick and tired of being sick and tired of this pattern. I think the last time I was on this show, I quoted somebody that was talking about the issue with the Mississippi water and saying that she said the people were running out of grace with the issue. And I've said the people have run out of grace on this issue in the Horn of Africa among Ethiopians and Eritreans. I mean, this start and stop where the TPLF glorifies and celebrates going into other regions and killing civilians and raping and doing all these things that they accuse the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean governments of doing for the first part of the war, which is really interesting. A lot of what they're actually doing is what they claimed that both governments were doing while they're in there. While some of that might be true, I imagine that a lot of it's inflated. TPLF is known for making up atrocities, but also committing atrocities on its own people in order to garner international attention. The 1980s famine is a huge example of that. While there were issues of food security there and actual famine in some parts, they raised all this money, got all this international attention. I think it was $100 million. And we learned later through one of their, mouthpieces now, Martin Plout and others who confirmed it, that 95 million, so a majority of that money was actually used to buy weapons. So they love parading the suffering of their people, and they're this double-minded creatures. On one hand, they say war is our game, it's what we do, like, let's bring it. And then on the other hand, often in English, they scream genocide when there's a response to that war. So, I don't want to jump the gun and say this is about to be over or it's imminent, but there is a sense that it's close. And unfortunately, the only way that TPLF and the ideology could be defeated is through war, because everything can be gotten through war. So when people were saying game over when the ENDF captured that region in 2020, the idea was your game of war, your game of ethnic politics, your game, of lying and using your own people to then get international attention and get into power is over. So they are victims on one side and there are victors on the other side. And there were a 5-month ceasefire that everybody should have welcomed, where a lot of aid was flowing in. What we're seeing now with Ethiopian National Defense Forces in control of some regions is they were hogging up all of this World Food Program and USAID grain while saying the people were hungry. So they were basically, what it looks like, is saving it for anyone who's willing to fight. And you see all these older people just gathering, getting their grain, their ration of grain, probably not able to get that when the TPLF rebels were in control. And you don't see a lot of young people in these in these videos, which is really frightening, because I've talked to some sources and they say in some cities there's not a lot of young people. We don't know what happened to them. Maybe some of them are still fighting, but we gather that some of them didn't make it back from the war front, and that's really sad. But if you look at the activists in the diaspora, they could care less. I mean, they're essentially saying in order for us to survive, TDF, what they call Tigrayan Defense Forces, needs to fight, which is so odd, because it's like there's nothing about their dying that's going to help us survive in the diaspora. So I think they're talking about their ego and their perception of what it meant to be a TPLF supporting Tigrayan. I mean, they don't even think you're Tigrayan or ethnic Tigrayan if you don't support this pool. So they're fighting for that identity, and that identity is crumbling before all of our eyes. So I'll let Eugene answer the AU part, though, because there is a coordination, but I do think there's some political games being played among the African leaders as well. I don't know about what Eugene thinks.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely some political games being played. I mean, as you already spoke to, I think earlier in the segment, Rania, I mean, you had this chorus of U.S. officials and also the head of the UN Human Rights not Human Rights, Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, come out with a similar sort of piece, all with almost the exact same language about the need for a ceasefire, this, that, and the third, and we'd be here all day explaining why, there already was a chance for a ceasefire and it was broken by the TPLF. But then you had, just a couple days later, the head of the African Union make almost the exact same statement, really looking just like Antony Blinken's statement about the need for a ceasefire, which, of course, on its face seems fine because war is terrible and it's always good when you can try to have an end to war. So, in that sense, it seems like it's basically okay. But ultimately, I think there's a couple of things at play. The first thing that I think is interesting is that this is allegedly a so-called African Union peace process, but we've seen the U.S. get increasingly involved over time. Mike Hammer has become involved over time. Also, at least if we can believe the New York Times, sponsored his own sort of secret talks to try to undercut the AU. But then you also have, at this context, Victoria Nuland, who you mentioned earlier in the show, Rania, who has no real history in Africa, but is a top official at the State Department, really, for meddling in other countries. So when she goes somewhere, they're getting ready to do something. And she goes to set up this strategic partnership with South Africa, where allegedly one of the issues they're addressing is going to be Ethiopia, along with Mozambique and a couple others. The talks are supposed to happen in South Africa. And then shortly thereafter, the AU, the alleged independent arbiter who's not being influenced by the U.S., puts out the exact same type of statement that the U.S. is putting out, and also accepting Uhuru Kenyatta as a mediator, which they previously had not done, so undermining their own mediator, former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo. So I think it's very clear when you look at the AU statement that the AU is they're either being bullied or they're acquiescing to the U.S. demands that are also have been echoed historically by Kenya, the former president Uhuru Kenyatta, that the TPLF narrative is correct. But obviously the narrative is not correct. The reality is the previous issue just a couple weeks ago, just before we had you on the last time, Hermela, there was a ceasefire that was in place. The TPLF launched a new offensive. They said they would not dialogue. They would not have talks with the government unless the government would be willing to restore all humanitarian services, all internet, all these other things, and whatever the questions are about that. The government said, we are willing to do this, but all we need from you, the TPLF, is for you to sign a ceasefire. So just to sign on the dotted line that the thing was happening, is really happening, and to show up for talks. That's all that they had to do. They refused to do that. So to say, well, there needs to be an immediate ceasefire, well, I mean, yeah, there does. But it's not a both sides kind of situation. It's one side that has used every ceasefire to rearm and launch new attacks. But I don't want to go on and on. But you can just see that the African Union, I think, should be ashamed and embarrassed, quite frankly, that their own process has lacked so much integrity, that it's been highly disorganized, that, on multiple fronts, they've struggled to get even really a clear sense of what's going on in front of the public. The press releases are often confusing and unclear. And I think it just shows that most of the African countries, quite frankly, lack sovereignty, lack independence, are weak, are more tied to their economic ties to the West and the neo-colonialism that still unfortunately afflicts so much of the continent, rather than really having the ability to act in a way that is possible to mediate between the two sides, which, is deeply, deeply unfortunate on so many different levels. One final thing I just want to ask you here before we let you go, Hermela, but I do want to get this in. What do you make of the fact that the TPLF has, in almost all their statements, made everything almost totally about Eritrea? I mean, you read their statements now, and it's like the word Ethiopia is barely mentioned. Abiy Ahmed barely merits a mention. It's like the TPLF versus Eritrea, which apparently is, controlling the entire world, according to them. I wonder what you make of that rhetorical shift and what it may mean about their positioning.
Yeah, it's actually kind of pathetic. It just seems like Eritrea lives in their heads rent-free. There is no proof that Eritrean soldiers are actually inside Tigray. Are they on the borders? Absolutely. And they have every right to be there. And part of the reason they're there is we don't want TPLF leadership escaping in the little caravans dressed up like women or whatever it is, whatever cover that they have. I mean, they are known to be that slick. So yeah, Eritrea needs to be on the borders of Eritrea and Ethiopia. And like I said, there's no actual proof that Eritrean soldiers, at least in large numbers, are inside Tigray fighting. It seems, I mean, we'll find out if this isn't the case, but it seems that a lot of the forces inside Ethiopia are Ethiopian forces, Ethiopian National Defense Forces. They have had time to mobilize and to train, and I think a lot of that training has also been done by Eritrea because of the tripartite alliance, but so be it. This is a neighbor. This is a neighbor that the country made peace with. And so I think part of the obsession with Eritrea is they know the West does not like Eritrea and its independent stance, and it's paid a hard price, a high price for taking that sovereign route, but somehow, some way, the country has been able to make it through, and it's this alliance between Ethiopia and Eritrea that I think that's going to see us through to another chapter of a more sovereign Ethiopia as well. So I think their obsession with Eritrea is knowing that the West does not like Eritrea, and if they just keep saying it enough, and I've even heard there were talks with some people in the West of trying to intervene somehow militarily, which is like a crazy concept to even consider. But that's how much they resent a country like that, in such a strategic location. And I also think on the side of the activists and the TPLF supporters, there's this, sense that they are, these like special warriors in Ethiopia. And that's why they were able to keep power for so long, 27 years. There's nobody that can run the government like us. There's nobody that knows war like us. And so it's much easier for them to accept defeat from a country like Eritrea on a military front than it is to say, you know what, maybe the rest of Ethiopia is getting their stuff together, and we're getting defeated. So I think it's two parts. It's the kind of dog whistle to the West, and then it's just this. It can't be that it's Ethiopia alone that's actually defeating us in what we have called is our game, which is war.
Oh, Eugene, you're muted.
I just want to get that in. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thank you, guys. See you soon. Appreciate it.
I'm always going to rep the South. I will always rep the South. If someone is from the South, I'm going to mention it.
You were muted, so nobody heard that part.
They heard that part. Hermela, who's from Ethiopia, but, spent a lot of time in
How?
Mississippi.
You were muted. You were
I was
muted.
not muted.
I swear, I couldn't hear you, and then I could.
You were muted.
We're going to go back and check. No, we're going to go back and check. Don't gaslight
Well, let's push
me,
forward.
Eugene.
Well, I don't want anyone on the other side to seem bad on our tech side, but let's push forward here. Very important story that we want to go to here, and that is the state of the death penalty in Oklahoma, which says a lot about the state of the death penalty in the United States. And we are honored to be joined here by Ngozi Ndule, who is the deputy director of the Death Penalty Information Center and one of the editors of a great new report, well, not great, but important new report, deeply rooted about how racial history informs Oklahoma's death penalty. Ngozi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the first question, and the pleasure is all ours, that I want to ask you is, it feels like, I mean, some of the things in this report just kind of blew me away that, I mean, Oklahoma might have an execution every month, through 2024, which just, again, was wow. But, it seems like we've got this duality here that in, the country itself, it feels like the death penalty is getting less popular. It's being used less. But in some of these places like Oklahoma, it's almost like they're ramping up. So it's almost, I don't know if it's an outlier or what it may be. But, how do you see how Oklahoma fits into this broader nationwide picture of the death penalty?
Sure. What we are seeing is what you mentioned, that there is a long-term trend that's moving away from the death penalty. So we see, Virginia just last year abolished the death penalty, in part because of racial justice concerns. We see a long-term decline in executions, in death sentences. We know that the last couple of years that COVID and the pandemic contributed to that, but this has actually been a much longer trend than just the pandemic years. What we're seeing is that there's a shift in public opinion. The height of the death penalty in the kind of modern era was in the tough on crime 90s, right? Where it was kind of along with all the other things that were lengthening sentences, increasing incarceration. There were a number, there was this peak of death sentencings where we had almost 100 executions. Now, for the last, 5 to 8 years, we've really seen this kind of decline, and we're seeing the same thing in public opinion, where support for the death penalty has reduced significantly over time. And when people are kind of given, other alternatives, they often pick those alternatives over the death penalty. And I think part of it is because of the reality of the death penalty that people are seeing, the reality of, 190 people exonerated from death row, the 20, 30, 40 years that some of those exonerations have taken, and the 20, 30, 40 years that people spend on death row, the reality that the most likely outcome of a capital case, even after you've gotten a death sentence, is that it's going to be reversed at some point. So in this context, we see Oklahoma starting on this series. They just had the second of these executions this morning, of executions, and planning this out, for the next 2 years. I think that the state itself is at a crossroads where they have been a national outlier, being second only to Texas, and there are individual counties that have had more executions than entire states, really. So the question really is going to be about kind of what the state what choices the states makes about what to prioritize and how they take the bigger picture to consideration. Because the racial justice issues that are raised in this report are not the only issues that have been raised in the state. There's been significant concern over the way that executions are being carried out because of a series of botched executions. There have been issues around kind of innocence and whether the state is actually doing enough to protect innocent people from being executed. We had those concerns come up along with racial justice concerns in Julius Jones' case last year. We're still seeing these kind of innocence questions in Richard Glossop's case, who is one of the people scheduled for execution.
Oklahoma has also been this kind of ground zero in national conversations about Native American rights. And in your report, you discuss some of the ways that the death penalty has impacted Indigenous populations in Oklahoma. So I'm wondering if you could actually speak a bit about that.
Sure. I think we can't talk about the use of the death penalty in Oklahoma without recognizing how that has intersected with Native American sovereignty. So there was a recent Supreme Court case about what the Native American tribes in Oklahoma had been promised and what the United States had agreed to in treaties. And the agreement was that they would actually have control over the way that the criminal legal system functioned in the reserved lands for their people. But the federal government would also have concurrent jurisdiction, right? But that means that the state of Oklahoma, that had been prosecuting crimes in this area throughout over time, had been acting actively in violation of these treaties for years and years and years. And the argument around that, well, this is how we've always done it, was not enough for the United States Supreme Court. And so in McGirt versus Oklahoma, they said, no, you can't actually exercise jurisdiction that violates a treaty. And because of that, one person, Patrick Murphy, was taken off of death row. Now, there were 4 other people that were supposed to be taken off of death row, but then the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals said, actually, your appeals had been final by the time that this case came down, so this doesn't apply to you, back to death row for you. So what we're seeing here is one of the ways that the death penalty and Native American sovereignty really are connected, because it's a question about the decisions that are being made by the Native American tribes that have been promised sovereignty. We've seen this in other instances as well. Lesmond Mitchell, who was executed by the federal government for a case that happened in Arizona, he was part of the Navajo Nation. The crime was committed against someone in the Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation specifically said that they did not want the death penalty to be pursued there. It was still pursued. He was still executed. Oklahoma in particular, because of its large Native American population and its history, has come up against this issue. And we also know that Oklahoma really represents a large percentage of the executions of Native American people in the entire United States. Almost 40% of the people executed, or of the Native American people executed in modern era, were from Oklahoma.
Wow. That's wow.
It's wild, yeah.
Just had to take a second on that one. That was, I wonder in that vein, what else we know about, especially racial disparities in Oklahoma. I mean, I think obviously in, states like Virginia, where I'm from, Florida, the African-American population, we're very familiar with the racial disparities. Is it a similar situation in Oklahoma?
I think there are nationwide, we see similar trends. And one of the biggest consistent findings is that the race of the victim matters. If you have a white victim in a homicide case, you are just much more likely to be charged with a capital crime. And, well, first of all, the case is more likely to be solved, to actually be cleared with an arrest. Then you're more likely to be charged with the capital crime. And then if we go down further, you're much more likely to be executed. Studies of Oklahoma's death row show that that is similar, that basically if you have, first of all, we know that executions in Oklahoma in the modern times, 75% of the executions have been for the murder of white victims. And that doesn't correspond with the way that that homicide happens, where most homicide is intra-racial, and that where we actually have, unfortunately, a really high homicide rate for Black people and Black men in particular. So you would expect, so this is the white victim numbers for executions are not in line with those figures. They're much higher. So in a society where we say we have equal justice for all, and where race is not supposed to play a role in the justice system, we know that this capital punishment system that is supposed to be punishing the worst of the worst for the worst of the worst crimes, that really race of victim is kind of a silent aggravating factor, is silently playing the role of saying, oh, it's a worse crime because the victim was white. And so we can think about that. We also can look at population, where African Americans are less than 10% of Oklahoma's population. But when we look at who's on death row, who has been executed, we're looking at much higher figures. We're looking at 40 or so percent. So when we're seeing the difference between those percentages, when we're seeing that, we're saying, okay, so the way that we're using the death penalty is not lining up to the demographics. It's not lining up to the homicide statistics. What is at play? And when we think about what is at play, that's why we thought it was important to talk about the overall historical context in which the death penalty has operated in the past, and which we know where the line between lynching and death penalty historically was very thin, and where they were seen as kind of alternatives. Sometimes executions were the more, respectable alternative, but sometimes there was this idea that, oh, the lynching actually sent the right message. And then when we're thinking about in the present, we can say, well, of course, we have a system where this is not allowed. We're not in, the Jim Crow days, but we're still seeing statistics that really resemble those days, right? We're still seeing this race of victim effect. We're still seeing disproportionate impact on people of color. And we're also still seeing this in the context of the broader conversation about the criminal legal system, whose lives are valued, and who, actually bears the brunt of even the system's mistakes. If we want to talk about exonerations, we know that police and prosecutorial misconduct are often involved in wrongful convictions, and specifically wrongful capital convictions. We know that people of color, and specifically Black people, are much more likely to suffer from police misconduct and prosecutorial misconduct among those who have been exonerated. We also know that it takes longer for them to be exonerated, on average 4 years longer for Black exonerees to actually get their freedom compared to white exonerees. So when we're seeing this, we're kind of putting together the full picture of the role that race continues to play in the criminal legal system across the nation, but specifically in Oklahoma.
Let me just ask you this last question before we let you go. And something I think is important is about the administration of the death penalty in Oklahoma. I mean, and certainly it hits on things that also hit nationally. I know Richard Glossop, who was mentioned earlier, I mean, he was the plaintiff on this issue of these midazolam-based executions, of which there have been many botched executions. I mean, it seems like perhaps Oklahoma is another one of these states that not just the death penalty itself, but the way they carry it out perhaps has a lot of issues to it.
Yes, I think that the method of execution in Oklahoma has come under a lot of scrutiny, and that scrutiny has been well-deserved. So thinking about the execution of Clayton Lockett in 2014, which was very visibly botched, and where there was an investigation into how that happened and why that happened, where we also, and then later the next year, where Charles Warner was executed with the wrong drug, and there was an attempt to execute Richard Glossop with that same wrong drug, where attorneys for the state were actually advocating, well, we can, it's just about the same thing. So we can see that there are bigger picture problems that we've seen in Oklahoma executions, and the investigations into those problems. One, we also see racial dynamics, the questions about Clayton Lockett executions. There was some testimony about, well, it's harder to find the veins of dark complected people, and the lighter, fair complected people have more accessible veins or something like that. But we also see that the questions about the kind of perspective that has been brought to these executions, there's this culture of secrecy that led to a focus on secrecy that was actually not compatible with actually following the policies and laws and procedures around executions. And this is what the grand jury found. This is what independent investigations and reports into the executions found, that there were significant problems that came from that lack of transparency and kind of an execution, get it done at all costs without allowing real all eyes into it. So I think that we know that this is not something that was a single case, but was present in a number of the executions that have happened recently in Oklahoma. And we had some kind of echoes of that recently with Oklahoma's execution of John Marion Grant, where there were some questions about, him regurgitating or vomiting and saying that was just, the way that the execution should have happened, and initial responses from Oklahoma officials that really were not, coming to grips with what could have gone wrong then.
Mm-hmm. Ngozi Ndule, the Deputy Director of the Death Penalty Information Center, we really appreciate you having you on, and I hope everyone checks out Deeply Rooted, How Racial History Informs Oklahoma's Death Penalty. I'm sure you have a lot going on, so thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, we want to move to another story here, which is sadly similar, and I think an important story that is getting very little information in relationship to it out of the state of South Carolina, and that is the death of Lavelle Lane. Lavelle Lane died in a South Carolina jail 6 hours after he was arrested. A lot of questions, not a lot of answers. We are very honored to be joined here by Beverly Lane Reese, who is the mother of Lavelle Lane, and Roxanne Thomas, who is the sister of Lavelle Lane. Oh, wait, sorry. We just might need 1 second here before we bring them on. I don't want to, presuppose too much about this case. I think it's an important. There we go. We made it. Sorry, I moved too quickly there. We weren't 100% ready, but shout out to our team. But thank you so much, Beverly Lane Reese, Roxanne Thomas, for joining us here on the show.
Hi.
Well,
Hello.
Beverly, I'll start with you here. Your son, Lavelle Lane, died in the custody of these officials shortly after his arrest. And, sadly, I think there has not been that much in the news about this story nationally. So maybe just tell us what took place, or to the extent you know what took place. Obviously, we're looking for answers from a lot of these officials.
Well, I really don't know because they haven't given us any kind of explanation as to why Lavelle is deceased. I mean, he went in there, from my understanding, on the 2nd of October, and at 11:01, and by 4:45, he was dead. I mean, they haven't shown us any footage. They haven't given us any how you say, any paperwork. When you're incarcerated, there's documentations of your movements, and Lavelle had mental illness, so they really didn't handle him properly. They handled him like he was a regular inmate. I'm not even gonna say he was an inmate, because within 4 hours and 45 minutes he was dead. I don't even know if he was fingerprinted. I don't know anything. I really don't. I don't know anything, because they haven't given us no shape, form, fashion of any kind of explanation as to why my son is deceased.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about him? What was he like?
Well, Lavelle was his energy was infectious. I mean, Lavelle, when he graduated high school, Lavelle was the valedictorian of his high school in Brooklyn, New York. I mean, we moved down here like 11, 12 years ago, and after a few years, he came down here with us, his dad and I, because he had this little mental illness going on. So we needed him close to us because we're his parents. And once he graduated high school, he went on with a full 100% scholarship to Howard University, athletic scholarship for track. So he wasn't a bad person. Mental illness doesn't mean that you have to be shunned by society. They need funding for people with mental illness. To me, that's not a death sentence. I mean, he's a good kid. He was a good young man. He wasn't a kid. I call him a kid because he's my son. But he was a good person. If the people that he knowed and come in contact with, they had nothing but good things to say about Lavelle. wasn't in trouble with the law. I mean, he wasn't doing things that he wasn't supposed to do. I mean, he was a young man. We all fall short, we all, no one's perfect, but he wasn't that type of person.
You know, Roxy, I'm curious. I mean, I think obviously for anyone who hears this story, it just feels like such a nightmarish story. I mean, as his sister, I mean, how does it feel not only to have this happen to your brother, but to be denied answers? I mean, from what I understand, the only thing that's really out yet is some sheriff posted on Facebook or something like that. I mean, talk about just that reality and the impact of it on you.
Well, honestly, I'm angry because how does, like, we went through the whole process of burying him, having a funeral, and still here, right here, right now. We don't even know why. Like, yes, that sheriff, he made a crass comment saying the poor fella went to sleep and didn't wake up. But that's not what happened. Like, and if that's what happened, why are you guys not communicating that with us? He said that on someone's Facebook post that called him out about the mysterious death of a black man while in custody of Spartanburg's detention center. So, I mean, it makes me livid. I'm angry, and it's like I can't do but so much, and I have to sit back and patiently wait for them to decide, okay, here you guys go. This is what happened. Like, we don't even have a death certificate.
Let me just ask you this quick follow-up to that, too. I mean, I don't even know what to say about this when I read it. I mean, but he was arrested for walking in the roadway. I mean, I don't even
Being a
know.
pedestrian in the roadway. I had to look it up to make sure that that is a legit thing here in South Carolina, and it is really it's a citation, like it's a ticketable offense, and they arrested my brother for being a pedestrian in the roadway because according to the arrest report, they said that there was a sidewalk to the right of him, so he should have been on the sidewalk.
I'm curious if, like, so now you're in the situation, you don't know what happened, you're not getting answers. What are the avenues for you all to use to try to get answers? Is like, who do you go to when something like this happens?
We have
So
obtained
Sorry, I'm sorry.
we
I probably
got
should have directed that to one person at a time. My apologies. Go ahead.
we have counsel behind us. We have the National Association for Racial Network. I'm sorry.
it's the
You
National
know,
Racial Justice Network.
yes. This is kind of, it's mind boggling for me. Right now, I mean, my mind is not totally together. I'm trying to hold it together because I don't know what happened to my son. Just as you sit there without knowing, we're in the same spot because they haven't given us nothing, 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 and that's the hurting part. That's the hurting part. So we don't know which way to go because we've never been through this situation. So the crazy questions is the ones you don't ask. So I've been in touch with some people that have lost their children to police brutality, and it's just a waiting game. Basically, it's just a waiting game because I don't have a
Roxy,
law degree.
right.
You know what I mean? But that's still my son. He's
Mm-hmm.
still my son regardless. And the way he was taken, he didn't die from natural causes, and I don't know why. That's the heart wrenching part, that I don't know why Lavelle Lane was buried. That's basically that's all I can really tell you because I don't know why. We couldn't touch with SLED. We called and called. They don't return our calls. The Spartanburg Detention Center says that SLED has taken it over. You call them and call them and call them. They don't return my calls. I mean, we have even took it upon ourselves to go to Spartanburg Detention Center. I mean, they give us the little open spiel that sorry for your loss. Sorry is not telling me anything.
Mm.
I know you're sorry because my son ain't here. You're no more sorry than I am. But why? That's the main conclusion. Why?
Okay.
You
Roxanne, did you want
know,
to add anything to that? Oh, sorry, Eugene.
no. Roxy, if you want to add anything to that, please go ahead.
I mean, no, she said exactly what I have to say. Like, no one's giving any answers, and no one is returning no phone calls. So we're being met with constant resistance from everyone. So
Yeah. No, I mean, I hear you 100%. And so, I mean, from my point of view, when you hear things like that no one's saying anything, it really makes you doubt that they aren't culpable to some degree. But, Roxy, I wanted to pick up on something that you had mentioned earlier, too, is this ridiculous, very crass comment made by this sheriff from Spartanburg, because he was at pains, it seemed, by making this statement to deny there was any racial element at all to what took place there. Now,
hmm
this is the United States. This is South Carolina. I mean, obviously we don't know what happened, but I mean, it seems from the arrest onward that it seems fair for us to think that there perhaps was a racial element to this.
yeah, he definitely noted that at some point in the comment that what does him being black have to do with it? But we are in the South, and I mean, I'm not saying that him being black makes it the way it is, but I'm almost positive if this happened to his son or his nephew or someone else that was of someone else that was white, I'm going to say it like how it was, there would be more outcry and forth, more forthcoming with what happened. Like, we are 18 days later and we don't know what happened. All we have is speculation.
Well, let me ask you this as well. For those who are watching, I think probably people hearing about this for the first time are going to be thinking, "Wow, this is unbelievable." What can or should people do to help get some justice and get some answers in this case?
Who you asking, me or my mother?
You, Roxy, please, or both of you if you want to speak to it for sure.
Okay, so by with counsel from with by speaking with the lawyers, they have communicated with us that they are in communication with like the head of SLED, and they're getting headway as far as getting the family into at least view whatever video or audio there is, because it is on record that it is video of my brother while he was in custody. So they said that they are getting headway with that. So we're trying to be patient and let the lawyers try to sort through it. But in the background, on our own accord, like my mother said, we've been to the jail. We've called SLED. We have activists behind us calling. They started a phone bank so that people can call the Spartanburg Police Department and City Council so that someone can amplify this story so that it can get some traction, so that we can get some answers behind it. We had a protest in front of the jail a week after. That's my brother, right? That's one of my brothers that you see. This is at the protest. Like, we had a protest and still nothing. We had a protest outside the jail and no one even came out to even say, well, at this time it's an investigation and we're like, no one came out. That's the moral of it. We did. And the last guy that you saw with the black shirt, that's who was calling out the sheriff as far as hey, this young black man is dead within a couple of hours in you guys' custody. What do you have to say about it? He tagged him like 40 times, he said, and that's what made him respond the way that he did.
Respond.
But even him, we reached out to him too, and he has not gotten back to us, but he can comment on Facebook.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, you know what I mean? That right there is callous. Excuse me. I mean, you will respond on Facebook. Me, as that young man's mother that you took in custody, you haven't reached out to me at all. This Chuck Wright, he hasn't reached out to me, period. He hasn't sent me no condolences. He hasn't sent no chaplain. He hasn't sent no grievance. I mean, we grieving over this. We are grieving over this. I mean, I can't even express. I don't sleep at night.
Mm.
You know, my son is gone, and I don't know why. And that right there is in it in the fact of it being in itself. You should be man enough. You're running a judicial department. You should be man enough to reach out to someone that died in your custody, to reach out to their family, to reach out to his mother. You know, he has other siblings. He has a father. You haven't contacted nobody of the Lane family, the Lane Reach family, period. No shape, form, or fashion. You give us these. I mean, I got a call from, uh, he was a SLED agent. Should I call his name or shouldn't I call his name?
It's up to you.
Well, anyway, I got a call from a SLED agent. What they gave me his number, and he told me it was under investigation, and it would be 6 to 8 weeks approximately that I would be able to view the video footage. Why would I have to wait so long to view the video footage? You've seen it. The coroner's seen it. Why can't I see it? What does me viewing the video of my son being confined in your jail have to do what you doing investigation?
On my side, it just seems like culpability to me. Like they're trying to get their story together or whatever it is, because I just don't understand how someone is dead and the family just doesn't know why. They talking
And I'm
about
not going nowhere.
toxicology, autopsy, craziness. They did an autopsy before they even knocked on the door and let us know that one, he was in custody, and
Mm.
two, he was dead.
Mm.
They
So
did an autopsy. The coroner knocked on my door at 10 a.m. Now, LaBelle was in custody from 11:01 to
PM.
4:45. They pronounced him dead. At 10 a.m., the coroner knocked on my door to tell me that my son was deceased. My husband answered the door, LaBelle's father, and he handed him a card from Gaffney's coroner, because they said Spartanburg has their own coroner, and Gaffney have their own coroner. They can't cross county lines, so he had to get Gaffney's coroner to knock on my door and tell me my son was deceased.
Mm.
That's about
And then
far as it went.
when we asked why the autopsy was done so fast, the coroner's response was everybody was in place at the time, so they just went ahead and did it.
Wow.
Whatever that means.
Well, I really
They didn't ask
appreciate you
me, did
both.
I
Go
want
ahead,
an
Beverly.
autopsy? Suppose I didn't want you cutting on my son.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get a chance to identify my son's body. You know, I mean, I don't know nothing about this because this is new to me. But I thought when people decease and pass, their family's supposed to come identify them. I did not see my son till the day before I put him in the ground.
Mm.
The day
Mm.
before. And the coroner told me, the Spartanburg coroner told me that in order for me to see my son, the funeral director that picks him up, whatever funeral director that we choose to pick up his body and take over, it will be to their discretion whether I see him or not.
Mm. Well, I really appreciate both of y'all. I know this is a very, very tough time, and we're glad to be able to put some spotlight on this, and we're going to keep following
I ain't
this
stopping.
story.
His death will not go in vain. I ain't
That's right.
stopping.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not stopping. I'm not stopping for the mental health. I'm not stopping for the police brutality. It's just enough is enough. Enough is enough. I mean, you have families that's out here. Just I'm not just speaking for me. I'm speaking for those that have went through this, and I'm pretty sure I can just bet my life that it will happen again, because this is a vicious cycle, and somebody got to stand up. Either you stand for something or you fall for anything. And I'm going to stand up for LaBelle.
That's
I'm
right.
going to stand up for him, and I'm going to speak up for him because
Mm.
it's not right. Come to us and have some accountability. That's what I'm seeking. Accountability.
Beverly Lane Reese, the mother of Lavelle Lane, Roxanne Thomas, the sister of Lavelle Lane. We thank you both so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Appreciate
Thank you
you
for
for
having
having
us.
us.
That one, I have to say, you know, I know we often say it's, you know, it's maybe not unbelievable, but that, you got to be kidding me. Walking in the street and then you end up dead 6 hours later. Obviously,
With
it reminds us
no
a lot of Sandra Bland.
explanation. No explanation, not
Nothing.
even like communicating with the nothing. What I mean, I don't even know. Just putting myself in the shoes of that family right now and thinking about anybody, any loved one, you can't get answers. And nobody seems to care. Like the state is just like literally turning its back to you.
Yeah,
And
I think for sure they're trying to get their story straight. But to get a little more context on this, we want to bring in good friend of the show, Kim Smith, organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, co-founder of the Soda City Bail Fund, that's in Columbia, South Carolina, and the outside liaison for Jailhouse Lawyers Speak in South Carolina. Kim, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, with this Lavelle Lane murder, that's what I'm going to call it, because that's certainly, you know, I'm going to call it that. And if someone wants to take issue, they can take issue. But, you know, you've been dealing with prison issues in South Carolina for a long time, prisons and jails, policing. Is this story surprising to you, or does it feel like this is kind of par for the course for the state?
I think what surprised me was how I wasn't surprised. Because this is South Carolina. I mean, how many times have y'all had me on here and we analyze and we talk about South Carolina? Brittany Martin was what, maybe a month ago?
Yeah.
You know, all of these different things. It's just on par for South Carolina. And unfortunately, we're seeing it get worse before it gets better. Because every time we think we have a win, South Carolinians, this ruling class here, you know, I like to call them the descendants of the planter class because they ain't, you know, call it what it is. They're still really trying to push down any progress and really trying to continue to oppress and further marginalize Black and brown working class people here.
So can you give us an idea of the situation in prisons and jails? I mean, because you weren't surprised. So this means that there is a level of brutality, perhaps even, you know, beatings, murders, who knows what going on that there's no accountability for. Is this a trend? Is this routine? What's going on inside these jails and prisons? And is there any accountability or avenue towards accountability?
I think Miss Beverly summed it up best. You know, her biggest thing was we don't know what happened. And that's a continued story of South Carolina prisons. We don't know what's happening. We know there's a trend where corrections officers are actually quitting. They can't keep people working because of the conditions in there, because of the torture that they want to put onto prisoners. And people are saying, no, they won't do it. So it has to make you think why, when people call and why people set up meetings with Brian Sterling. See, I'm naming names today. Miss Beverly was too nice. She's such a kind person, but we naming names. You know, why we can't get answers on what's happening. You know, I have people that I communicate with inside jails. Letters are getting returned and we can't get responses and they're not getting mail. And families haven't seen people incarcerated for years and spending years in solitary. So we really never have a clear picture of what's happening. But some of the conditions that we do know are, you know, a report just got released about the kitchens in Alvarez Glen, the detention center, consistently having rats in the kitchen, consistently having black mold, consistently having a C, but still being able to operate as if they're on an A score and never getting a proper full evaluation again. So we know, you know, those are the things that are getting leaked. But once it gets leaked, there's no follow-up. They don't want to comment.
You know, I think when we look at this, and obviously, you know, maybe it's obvious to a lot of people, but I think it still deserves to be said. I mean, it seems like there is a distinct racist element to the nature of these sorts of policies. I mean, you know, obviously the very fact that this guy felt he needed to say something on Facebook like, oh, we're not racist, is exactly the thing that's like, oh, well, obviously they're racist. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Why do you need to say that? But talk, if you could, about that element, about the law and order politics of South Carolina, Kim.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. And I'm so glad you pointed it out, Eugene, because it's obviously racism. With the bail fund, some of the trends that we look at is how charges are stacked with people who get incarcerated in Richland County at Alvarez Glen and in Lexington County at Lexington Detention Center. And we notice overwhelmingly that Lexington, which is a white county, very racist. Racism is ingrained in Lexington County, South Carolina, also where I grew up. And the charges are stacked so high that people are facing 10s and 20 years in a detention center for petty theft because they're just adding charges. And you can see the trend in the disproportionate sentencing of Black and brown people in both of these facilities. And it's very deep rooted. And that's just a trend that we saw as a bail fund, bailing people during the 2020 George Floyd Breonna Taylor uprisings, and a trend we've continued to see even now that those demonstrations are over. And Richland County is also a Blacker county, and you can see from there how the bails are bigger. You know, they might not be stacked as high, but a lot of the bails are also bigger with certain, you know, very specific different type of charges. And this is where they also just throw a charge at the wall in Richland County and just give it to you.
Kim, not that it's okay for this to happen to somebody who's arrested for another reason, but the fact that he was arrested for walking in a roadway, like, that's an arrestable offense that gets you jailed? Walking in the roadway? I mean, that just sounds to me like a cover for just being, I mean, it's like, do people get jailed for jaywalking? Like, I can't see it in any other way other than some sort of like racist law that just gives you a reason to arrest a Black person. But I always thought you'd have to commit a felony to be put in jail. So why was he taken to jail for walking in the roadway? Can you explain that? Is there an explanation?
I mean, I think the easiest explanation is, you know, it is what it is. It's racism. It's that ingrained systemic racism in South Carolina that will oppress and inhibit and have people incarcerated by any means necessary. I mean, Brittany Martin was once arrested for what? Yelling at a cop, basically. But they called it something fancy, a high nature of it, aggravation, like a charge we had never even heard, people had never even heard of. During 2020, during all these protests, we had people who were just giving out water, but they got hit with felonies for handing out water to protesters. So, these shouldn't be charges. These shouldn't be laws. These shouldn't be charges, but they do it just for the simple fact is because they can, or they feel like they can.
Kim, let me ask you this before we let you go here. I think people feel such a level of outrage when they hear these kind of stories. What can they do anything specific to these cases, but just in general, I think people feel a lot of outrage, but often feel a sense of powerlessness.
I think it's so many things people can do. Ms. Beverly mentioned how people are doing phone zaps to get answers. And I think letter writing to people incarcerated is also just something that people don't think about and talk about enough. It's something really to empower people incarcerated. I really wanted to just make sure that people understand that it starts there. These are the people that are facing these conditions. As for people on the outside, we need to be informed. So many people say, I didn't know, or I didn't know what was going on. But we have to stay informed and we have to stay organized. We have city council members in Richland County who knew about the conditions and the filthy conditions of kitchens in Richland County, and nobody wanted to comment. If people would rally and force them to comment at these city council meetings, force them to put people incarcerated at the top of the agenda, we will see something. We will see any small changes. And I also just want to say, this also goes down to sheriffs. You see this comment this racist sheriff made? Sheriff Leon Lott said that we weren't being tough enough, that judges should be harder on sentencing to stop people going back and committing crime. And I think that speaks to the nature of we need to also be up in the sheriff's faces because they're a part of the system. And also making sure we're speaking out and rallying against these things. If they're at a press conference, go disrupt it. If they're somewhere speaking and spitting all this racist propaganda, make sure you say something. Governor Henry McMaster decided he wanted to appeal the decision to not use a firing squad. He wanted to appeal that. So we should be at his office. We should be at the governor's mansion. We should be shaking up every part of this system in an organized way because that's the only way that they're going to know that they cannot continue to do this to our communities.
Mm-hmm. Kim Smith with the Soda City Bail Fund, Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Jailhouse Lawyers Speak Outside liaison. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side. Well, Rania, it's a sad state of affairs in the so-called freest country on earth. I think if you watch this show tonight, you would know that that's a mockery in many different ways, but at least I am very grateful to everyone who helps donate and make Breakthrough News possible. Shout out to that anonymous £5 donation so that we can have a platform to bring you the type of guests that we had here tonight on a range of different topics. I think, of course, as always, Rania, it brings us to the end, but I think it's an important time to remind people on that front. You can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news, and you can become a patron of the show, ongoing donor. Shout out to all of our current patrons and patrons to be. We appreciate everything. I always am deeply appreciative to be alongside you, Rania, and I'm looking forward to being back next Thursday.
Same, Eugene. Great show.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.